Hello, everybody. Welcome. Great to see so many people have found your way back to that word chat after our summer off. Greetings from the southern studio, as I like to say, here in Sarasota, Florida. It was sunny until for most of the day today, but it's turned cloudy and rainy. We're not expecting too much bad weather until tomorrow. For those of you who have expressed concern, we're taking it very seriously. The hurricane coming through. If you're in the area, we hope people are finding shelter. We believe we're beyond the surge area, and we're in a fairly solid place, and we have a safe area to go to, and we have an escape plan. So I just wanted to get that out of the way so people understand that I'm not being cavalier about it. But we're glad we can still do that word chat in anticipation of the storm tomorrow. And we have for our first show back, we're going to look at Australian English. Should be a lot of fun. We've got back Danica Salazar, who is Oxford English Dictionary's executive editor for World Englishes. And you remember her, she was on, it's been 2 years already, but she was on a couple of years ago talking about the new Oxford Dictionary of African American English. But a few months ago, the Oxford OED added dozens of Australian words, so we want to talk to her about that. So, Danica, welcome. Wonderful to see you again.
Hello, Mark. It's great to be back. Thanks for
Yeah,
inviting me again.
yeah. So let's get that out of the way. The Oxford Dictionary of African American English. When we had you on the show, it was a concept and a plan, and soon after you named Henry Louis Gates Jr. was named editor in chief, and it's made some progress, I guess. So where does it stand now?
Yes, so actually, since we've spoken, I'm no longer part of the team, but that's actually very good news because that
Mhm.
means that ODE already has its own dedicated team of lexicographers working on the dictionary. So, of course, we still have Henry Louis Gates, as you've mentioned, as our editor in chief of the dictionary. But we also have our board, advisory board of the dictionary, consisting of leading scholars on African American language and culture, and also lexicographers, as I said, working for the team now. They're currently working on researching and writing the first 1,000 entries for the ODAE, which you should be seeing shortly. And already,
Shortly?
shortly, I mean, I can't really commit to a time, but
Yeah.
I would say look out for that. There should be some concrete news coming out very soon, but already the team and their research has already yielded some very interesting insights on the vocabulary of African American English and its impact on English more generally, and actually in next week, I think they're going to be hosting a webinar. So you might put a link maybe in the chat later for that if people are
Oh,
interested to attend that. So the webinar will be specifically about hip hop and rap and how much this music has become a source of an important source of evidence for Africa for the work on the ODAE, and how
mhm.
much this culture has influenced not only the vocabulary of African American English specifically, but the vocabulary of English in general. So it should be quite a fascinating discussion and a good way to learn more about what's happening with the ODAE and to get to know the people who are actually working on the dictionary.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that. I'm on the email list, but I didn't see that one, so I'll have to take a look. But today we want to talk about Australian words because a few months ago in the summer, early summer, there was a announcement that the OED had added a bunch of new Australian words, including Aussiness, which is terrific. And I'm curious, I so the OED has had Australian words for 120 years, right? So was this a special project where there's a whole bunch added at once?
I mean, you're right in pointing that out, Mark, that, this adding new Australian English words is not something new to the OED. We've always had words originating in Australia, but this recent update is a particularly large update. I think it consists of around 60 words. And that was part of a project that we launched a few years ago that looked specifically at the vocabulary of Australian English. And that is part of what we're calling our World English Program, which is so that's actually the program that I'm leading at Oxford Languages, in which we look at different varieties of English spoken throughout the world, and we see how it's being covered by the OED, and then launching targeted editorial projects for them to make sure that we're filling in the gaps, adding words that we still don't have, revising words that we already have, but maybe a little bit outdated. So it just so happened that the work that we started on Australian English as part of that program was ready to be published this year. So that's why we had that particularly large batch of Australian English words being added to the OED this year.
Okay, so I want to ask you about the words themselves, but this maybe, I love tangents, but I'm curious about the nuts and bolts, like how it works. How do you decide? So having a World English editor, how long is that? Let's start with that. How long has that been around? Is this a new concept, or has this been around for
Yeah,
decades?
I mean, well, I think I'm the first person to have that specific role. So again, that's not to say that that the OED didn't think of covering world Englishes until I showed
Mhm.
up. It's always been something that's been a part of the OED's work since I always give as an example, because I'm from the Philippines, and I'm always very proud to say that from the very first fascicle of the OED, so the very first incarnation of the dictionary that was published in 1884, so the one, from James Murray's time, on page 5, there is a word, abaka, which is from the Philippines. So, which is really a good example to show that World English has, to a certain degree, been a part of the OED. But the fact of having a World English editor now is just showing greater commitment on the part of the dictionary to covering different varieties of English, because now we are actually looking at the word systematically. So not just because, the word abaka just happened to be in the range of A words that they were working in at the time. No, this time we're actually looking at different places where English is spoken in the world, and carrying out editorial projects specifically to find out the words for them. So engaging consultants, making use of specific evidence sources, like looking for new databases, corpora that we can use to identify the words. So it's a much more systematic approach to covering the way that the different words that are spoken in different parts of the world, and especially since the English speaking world has changed so much since the time James Murray and his colleagues added abaka in the late 19th century. Now English has now become a truly global language, and there are many places in the world now where English plays either an official role or it's a main second language. And of course, it just makes sense that when a language is transplanted to a different place, it will develop new vocabulary. So if the OED is to fulfill its remit of telling the history of English, then that part of its history should not be left out of the dictionary.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. And you mentioned and really, what a cool job. I'm sure we're all jealous of of the job you have. You mentioned consultants, so that's a good time to bring in our another guest. We have an Australian, thankfully, and it's very early in Australia, and I've had I've heard complaints from Australians that we should do it later so they can wake up for it. So we're very appreciative when somebody does make it from that part of the world. And when we sent the announcement out, we did the webpage. We had Celeste Rodriguez, who was a consultant for the OED, and she had a family emergency and can't be here. But we do have we had Amanda Laugesen on the show when we did a Word of the Year episode. This is several years ago now. So it's been a while, but she's agreed to come back. And Amanda, welcome. Thank you for getting up in the morning to come see us.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, it is a bit early in the morning, so I hope you'll forgive me drinking my tea just to keep me get me awake this morning.
That's
Thank
fine. That's fine. And Amanda is chief editor of the Australian National Dictionary, Australian Words and Their Origins, which I have to admit, until I read that, I was not aware that that's something that existed. So I think it's very cool, and I need a copy, but it looks kind of expensive. Um, and also director of the Australian National Dictionary Center at Australian National University. And you have a new book. I should probably mention that so I don't forget. Australia in 100 Words, which just came out recently. I don't know if is that available this part of the world or else outside of Australia?
I think it will be. It's only just been released here in Australia, but I think there is a deal with an American publisher, so I think it should be available at some point in the not too distant future. I
Yeah.
hope.
And speaking of, cool jobs, you're a historian and a lexicographer, which I don't suppose all lexicographers are historian, but I guess especially with the OED being a historical dictionary, it's kind of a cool thing that goes hand in hand. Um, and I read about the Australian National Dictionary, and I was curious about. So I've just been reading. You're probably both aware, Sarah Ogilvy's The Dictionary People, and there was a one of the dictionary people was Edward Ellis Morris, who I was reading about his contributions to the OED 130 years ago, whatever it was, and that he said, "Oh, you know what? I've got so much here. I should do my own dictionary." And I believe that this is sort of the Australian National Dictionary is a outgrowth of that. It's a it's a successor to that.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, Morris's
Yeah.
dictionary was yeah, he worked very closely with the Oxford English Dictionary and
Mhm.
contributed citations to the Oxford English Dictionary, and then created a dictionary called Austral English, which covered both Australian and New Zealand English in it, and included a lot of flora and fauna and words borrowed from Aboriginal languages and words borrowed from Maori as well. And yeah, I guess that is kind of the prototype of the more scholarly dictionary. There's a very long popular Australian slang tradition in Australia, which tends to focus on the colourful slang words and idiom. But Morris was kind of the prototype of the more scholarly dictionary, and recognizing the strong contribution of flora and fauna and words from Aboriginal languages, which definitely informed Bill Ramson, who was the editor of the first Australian National Dictionary. And Bill, that came out in 1988, and Bill worked with the Oxford
Mm.
English Dictionary team. I think John Simpson at the time was the person who he worked most closely with. Birchfield was overseeing the work, but it was John Simpson that he worked with most closely. And then that dictionary, the connection between the Australian National Dictionary and the Oxford English Dictionary continued until quite recently, when our funding, unfortunately, we don't get funding from Oxford anymore for the Australian National Dictionary. But definitely the Australian National Dictionary was very much, something that worked closely with the Oxford English Dictionary over the years, and going back to Morris, there's that connection there as well. And Bill, when he was doing the first edition of the Australian National Dictionary, very much saw the Oxford English Dictionary method, the way in which it was constructed, as being the best way to construct a dictionary on historical principles. So,
Mhm.
obviously we do have some differences, but that methodology is very similar, and we use the citations, and we very concerned with writing long etymologies and understanding how the words have evolved and where they've come from.
Okay. And I don't know if we only just met together, and I don't know if you and Danica and Amanda know each other. Have you worked together?
Yes, we do.
I,
Yes.
I assume all lexicographers know every other lexicographer.
No, we do know each other and we've
Yeah.
worked together. Actually, Amanda's background is very familiar to me because the last time, because when we have Zoom meetings and things, and I think the last time we did, she also participated in this World English Symposium that we hosted a couple of years ago. So yeah, and of course we always, as Amanda said, what makes the A&D a valuable resource for the OED is that just like the OED, it's also a historical dictionary. So they also include not just definitions, but also etymological information and quotations. So when we're researching Australian words, of course, A&D is one of our first ports of call, and we always try. And Amanda is always very accommodating whenever we email her with any questions or anything like that. So it's a collaboration that's still going on to this day.
Right. Great. Okay, well, let's get into Australian words. What typified this new batch of words that people came up with?
Well, so we've tried to, and I'd be congratulations on the new book, by the way, Amanda. I'd be very interested to see if any of the words in this update made it to your 100. But so we tried to look for the words that we found to be most typical of current and historical Australian English and show, that whenever we do these projects, we always try to show different ways of different means of lexical innovation in the variety that we're working on. So not just, so the most common one, of course, is borrowing from other languages, but also, different, the creative ways that people make new words in that place. And of course, when you think of Australian English, one of those ways is, what we call hypochoristic uses, or the shortening of words. So in this
I'm sorry, what was the word? Hypo?
yeah, I think it's called, the technical, at least in the etymology section of the OED, that's what we call it, a hypochoristic usage of such and such
Okay.
word. So for example, we've got words such as alco for alcoholic, doco for documentary, or quadi for quadrella. This kind of a horse betting thing that that Australians have for the Melbourne Cup particularly. Yeah, so that kind of thing of short. And there's also, my favorite one is blunnies, because those are two means of of word creation. So that's first is genericization, is when you take a brand name and then turn it into a generic noun. And then, because of course, since it's Australia, they also had to shorten it as well. So blunnies are a type of shoe, like kind of boot. Correct me if I'm wrong in anything, Amanda. But so the brand name is originally Blundstone. And that was originally, then it was later shortened to blunnies. So that's another word that's in the update.
So that's something that I think of when I think of Australian English. I think of these sort of cute shortenings. I'm actually just reminded of sort of the where we got the word soccer. It was sort of it was a shortening, and it was a playful thing in British universities, uh, it's way back when. So is that something that is uniquely Australian, or do you see that sort of word construction commonly elsewhere?
Well, of course, I mean, it happens a lot. I mean, it happens in other varieties as well. So for instance, in Southeast Asia, we love shortening words, but it's more about making up acronyms rather than shortening words. So I think, although it does happen in other varieties, I think it's in Australia where it happens more often. So for example, in this update of 60 words, we have like maybe 10 of them that's like that, or a little bit less. So that's quite a larger percentage than what would happen in other varieties. And I don't really know why that is. Maybe Amanda can give some insight.
Yeah, there's got to be a
Yeah.
good theory for that.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure about, like I don't know what the proportion of, how often we do it compared to other countries. Certainly the IEO endings are definitely seen as a distinctive marker of Australian English. I think the O endings in particular seem to be something that's really quite common in Australia, and perhaps even more O endings than IE continue to be introduced into the language. So I was just looking at some of the new things that we've been looking at. Gatho, for example, is a new entry that we've just put in, which is short for gathering, which is used by young people. I think we had a couple of others. I mean, and well, this is an IE ending, but granny for our grand final in the football. So yeah, definitely a feature of Australian English. Interestingly enough, a lot of our evidence seems to suggest it really only comes into Australian English or becomes popular sort of around the turn of the 20th century. So that seems to be where a lot of the first evidence sits. Now, that could just be a result of the evidence itself. So you're only seeing it in print around that time. But I think once it becomes a kind of feature of Australian English, and we always talk about it as a feature of Australian English, it's almost as if that becomes a thing that Australians do. We like to shorten our words. And it sort of speaks to that sense of informality. That's very much a marker of Australian English. And part of how we see ourselves, that we are informal with our language, that even in formal contexts, we will use those kinds of abbreviated words, or we will use slang words or colloquial words in these more formal contexts. That's part of a kind of, I think, a sort of self-identity, a kind of way in which we perform language.
Yeah, and it strikes me as maybe, it's very common in young person slang here, but then it's slang. It becomes something that doesn't last or stick. But it seems like in Australia, there's a willingness to sort of say, oh, this is a cool word. Let's just keep that as part of the language. Yeah. We did have one. I didn't say at the beginning that we do like to have questions from the room. If anybody joining us has a particular question about anything to do with World English or specifically Australian English, please go ahead and ask it. And I think Beverly, I don't know if you're ready, but Beverly had a question I saw in chat. And I may have surprised Beverly.
Yeah, well, I think this was a question actually about the Australian National Dictionary. So I put in an answer into the chat. So this was just for people who might have heard of the Macquarie Dictionary, which is another dictionary that's produced here in Australia. So we also do editing of the general reference dictionaries for Oxford Australia. So we do produce a series of dictionaries for Oxford Australia school dictionaries and some general reference dictionaries. But there are basically two main publishers. So there's Oxford that publish general reference dictionaries, and also the Macquarie Dictionary. So the Macquarie Dictionary was first published in the 1980s. They are separate endeavours, rivals. And the Macquarie Dictionary is a dictionary of English as it is used in Australia. So it covers the entirety of the English language as it's used in Australia. The Australian National Dictionary just includes words that are uniquely Australian, or which are first used here in Australia or have special meaning in Australia. So it's a very particular research dictionary that aims to document the entirety of the unique Australian English lexicon.
Okay. So I have the Macquarie Dictionary on as one of my apps on my phone. I've got, I pride myself in having a whole bunch of dictionaries on my phone so I can get to it. But the Australian National Dictionary, probably then no app. I have to purchase the big 2-volume.
No, I was going to say that we are very close to finalizing an online version that will be freely available. We just have we're at that sort of point where it's close, but it's like moving in tiny increments as we try to get the technical problems sorted out. But we are hoping to launch within the next short while. So yeah, fingers crossed on the technical front. But with around, because our second edition came out in 2016, was about twice the size of the first edition. And we're going to sort of launch 2.1, edition 2.1 online, which will have around 300 new entries and maybe, well, you know, about 1,500 updates in terms of quotations or revisions. So, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, and speaking of technical troubles, a couple of things. Beverly said she wasn't able to unmute to ask the question. You know, Zoom trouble. And then I'm told nobody heard the intro music at the beginning, and I know most people tune in just for that intro music. But when I shared, it said I should download some Zoom feature to Zoom sound or something like that. So I didn't have time to add that. So I'm sorry, we'll have to fix that for next time. But you know, I hope you're all humming it, the theme song anyway. So let's talk about, so many of the words and part of the focus, as I understand it, Danica, was Australian Aboriginal English. And I'm curious, you know, I know that growing up in Michigan, there are many Aboriginal words for place names and, well, mostly place names, but also animals and things. And I imagine that's very typical of any borrowing into English for a language. But are there some other things that typify what you uncovered in terms of Australian Aboriginal English?
Yeah, so one of the main goals that we had when we were working on this project as well was to add more words from Australian Aboriginal English, and also to revise the words that we added before. And of course, several of the words that we added, if you look at the list, are borrowings from Australian Aboriginal languages. So actually, it's a plural.
Right.
So one thing that we really had to rectify with regard to the unrevised Australian Aboriginal entries is the etymology. So we worked with a consultant, Dr. Louisa Michelli, who is an expert on she's a historical linguist who researches Australian Aboriginal languages. So we can be more specific about which languages these words actually come from. Because in earlier editions of the OED, you would find some entries where it would just say from an Australian Aboriginal language, which is as vague as saying like a Spanish borrowing into English is from a European language. You know, it's just such a varied range of different languages. So we just really had to make sure to be, now that we have greater access to expertise and to current research, then we are much more able to be more specific about where these words are come from if they are borrowings. But apart from so I think someone on the chat mentioned one of them, Duliga, which is a borrowing from actually it comes from two languages spoken in New South Wales, so Durga and Darawal. So it refers to a large hairy creature or monster spirit that's part of the culture of the folklore of those communities. So but apart from borrowings like that from specific Australian Aboriginal languages, we also found some really interesting specifically Aboriginal uses of just general English words that we all know. So for instance, the word cheeky, like as people use, well, you in America, you don't really use it that much, but where I am right now, you know, in the UK, it's a word that you hear a lot, right? But so a child can be cheeky, but Australian Aboriginal English, a cheeky can actually mean can refer to people to things or animals or people that are actually more dangerous than just naughty. You know, they can be so it means something cheeky means causing or liable to cause harm or dangerous or some. So if it's a person or an animal, it's one that's violent or aggressive. So you can talk about like a cheeky dog. So it's not a dog that's just being cute or naughty. It's a dog that can actually kill you. So those the things
that could be
like
confusing.
that, yeah, that could be confusing. So if someone warns you in Australian Aboriginal English of a cheeky dog, then you really have to pay attention.
Right.
So it's that sort of thing that we've also added to as part of this update.
And that's interesting because I mentioned growing up in Michigan, there are a lot of Ojibwe words that are sort of around, but especially place names, rivers, and things like that. But I don't see that there's one thing that it occurred to me from reading about the changes is that there are words like that that go into the Aboriginal language and then come back into English. Um, Modified or so I mean there are different definitions, but are there also different words that sort of it seems like there's interplay there that I'm not aware of happening in the United States in terms of Aboriginal language and the broader English language.
Yes, I mean, and I think that's something that can be expected because, as I said, that there's great diversity within the different communities of Aboriginal peoples in Australia, and there are communities that they live in Australia. Australia is their land. They live there and they speak English, but they also speak their own languages. So I think it's only natural when you have these English in contact, and we see that in a lot of places where English is spoken along with other languages, that there's naturally a lot of borrowing and a lot of adapting. So English cannot just continue to be just the way it's spoken by all Australians. It's just natural for Australian Aboriginal people to have their own ways of saying things, to have specific meanings for certain words, different ways of using words, using different ways, different expressions that are only understood by peoples within the communities, and yeah, and that means that there's quite a lot of vocabulary creation in that space of contact.
Yeah. Do you see
Yeah.
words? Oh, sorry, go
Yeah.
on.
No, I was just going to jump in. I mean, I just sort of wanted to, kind of recognize firstly the sort of 300 to 700 Aboriginal First Nations languages that existed in Australia before invasion. And now there's only about 13 languages that are considered to be strong, 12 to 13. So there's a very big effort being made to revive a lot of those languages. And then you have as Danica's talking about, the Aboriginal English, which I think now would generally be called Aboriginal Englishes. We tend to, like the OED, just use the label Aboriginal English, but there are a number of Aboriginal Englishes that are spoken around Australia. And yeah, words sort of going in from English into Aboriginal English and then coming back out. So a word like deadly, which is taken into Aboriginal English and used in a specific way to kind of mean cool, in a similar way, I think, to how it's used in Irish, in fact, in Irish English. And then now has kind of, I still think non-Indigenous people would feel perhaps a little bit uncomfortable about using some of those words, but I think we would definitely recognize it. So we have something called the Deadly Awards here in Australia to recognize achievements in First Nations communities. And so a word like that is sort of instantly recognizable. A word from Western Australia, your consultant, Glenys Collard and Celeste Rodrigo, I think might have given you advice on this word, but the word Dadi, which is a word that's been used into Aboriginal English and then coming into more broader use in Western Australia to mean somebody who's kind of sexy or cool. So yeah, there's a lot of interplay, but I think also just recognizing that kind of richness of the variety of languages that are spoken, and the way in which Indigenous people kind of move between these Aboriginal English, potentially Indigenous language. There's Creoles. There's a whole sort of range of languages that sometimes are so small that they don't perhaps get recognized even within Australia, but sort of so important to sort of recognize that richness of language.
So I'm sorry, what was the last word that meant sexy or
Dardy?
dawdy? Dawdy? Okay.
Dardy, I think it's usually spelt. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try to work that into my vocabulary. But so that's a word that is not in English, but I'm curious about words like deadly and cheeky. do those make it into the general English non-Aboriginal speakers, or is that just too confusing to to make that leap?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I mean, I'd be interested to look at usage of something like deadly because I think all non-Indigenous people would recognize it here in Australia, but
Yeah.
I just don't know how comfortable non-Indigenous people would be using an Aboriginal English word.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know that I can absolutely answer to what extent those meanings, you know, those special meanings that have attached to Aboriginal English words are now moving back into usage. Did you include, you've already got deadly in the OED, Danica?
I'm not sure. It's not part of this update, so it may be that
Okay.
I read it earlier, but I would need to check. But yeah, but if it's
Yeah.
not
But
there, then
actually,
certainly it's something that we
but
should.
yeah, yeah, sorry. One of the terms that you do have on that list, foot falcon. So to travel by foot falcon is to walk. And so we have you might not know, because I don't think the car's called this in America, but we've got a car called a Falcon, which was, you know, hugely popular and quite cheap. So a lot of
Ford
people
Falcon, yeah,
would have a
yeah.
Ford Falcon. And so you can travel by foot falcon, and that's a word from Aboriginal English. But interestingly enough, that was included in a book of sort of popular Australian slang that came out quite recently, and that kind of suggests that that term has kind of moved into broader usage. Sorry, I haven't looked at the quotations you have for foot falcon, Danica, but yeah, we've got it in the Australian National Dictionary. So I think, yeah, there is a bit of interplay, things moving in and out of Aboriginal English into general Australian English.
Yeah, I did my quick, copy editor background checking, and Ford Falcon is a car that was built in the 1960s and ended in 1970, but it's considered a collectible car. You know, it's a cool old car. But us in Australia, it was made until 2016, so that's it's a little bit different. So. So I want to put Danica on the spot with this. Well, either of you, do you know how many Australian words are Australian origin words are in the OED?
No, I don't know because that number is always changing because we
Yeah.
add new words not only through these large projects but also as just part of our regular update. So I wouldn't.
Mhm.
I mean, I would be able to. And also, how do we even get
Yeah.
that number? So that because these words that originating in, for instance, one originally Australian word that you might know about is selfie. So our research
Oh.
has shown that it was Australians who invented the word selfie, but no one would think specifically of Australia now when they say selfie. So would that count an Australia as an Australian word? So it's kind of we wouldn't say that's an Australian English word now, but it does have Australian
Mhm.
origin. So it's kind of difficult to pin down. But what I can say is there are definitely hundreds of words in the OED that are either used exclusively in Australia or has some kind of origin or relationship to Australia.
Yeah. Okay. And a similar question, and also you feel free to say no, is do you know what you study world languages and their contributions to or world English? Do you is some are certain languages more or certain former colonies or areas of the world contribute more to world English than others?
Mm, well, it depends on it's again it's another question that's hard to answer because
Mhm.
the answer
I
is
like hard to answer
and
questions. Yeah.
I find that people love to ask me that question.
Yeah.
Whatever variety I'm talking about, they always say, "So, how many words in total are there? And how many words?" Like, I feel like people have this kind of urge to say, "Oh, our country has contributed more
Hmm.
words to the OED than this other country." But I think I don't think it's really that significant. I mean, it is an interesting question to ask, but it really depends on. I don't think it's solely just about the influence of of the language or the place on English, but also, you know, how much evidence is available, because there's also that practical that's practical side of it. And you know what I mean, as world English editor for the OED, what keeps me up at night is the idea of all of these words that are floating around and documented, because the evidence for them has not yet been digitized, and they're all like kept away, hidden in a library somewhere that we're not able to access, you know. So that's the sort of thing that worries me, right? So that's why I've always loathed to talk about just raw numbers, because what do they tell? Sometimes it's just about what the OED is unable to do right now, just because we don't have the same access to evidence sources for that variety than we do for other varieties. So we don't want to give the wrong impression that, oh, we don't think this variety or this country is less important as an English-speaking country, just because we have less of it in the dictionary, because there's so many factors that you know, that influence those numbers.
Right. And that's one thing I've learned over the past few years, that lexicography can be hard. And, you know, people will say, why isn't this word in the dictionary? Well, it's going to get there. We just, you know, there are limited resources, and there's a process to doing it. So,
yeah, I mean, I've long accepted that that comprehensiveness, especially with world Englishes, is never really something that we can aim for. Especially for the Oxford English Dictionary, because it's more of a generalist dictionary. You know, we do invest a lot of time and effort into world Englishes, but there's also, you know, Middle English words, Old English words, current words. So there's so many words that need the attention of a limited number of editors with limited number of hours that they can use for working. So we're trying to, it's just a matter of prioritizing. So for me, the goal, more than comprehensiveness or any notion of completeness, what we're looking for is representativeness. So the numbers, the words that we do have for a particular variety, we want them to be representative of what variety is. So for example, with Australian English, just 60 words is, those are very few words if you think of the totality of Australian English. That's why we have the Australian National Dictionary. We need a whole dictionary dedicated to this particular variety. But with the OED, there's a certain limit to what we can add. So what we can add, we wanted to make sure that it really reflects the creativity of Australian people, their sense of humor, and all the diversity of the population. So that's why we put so much effort into including Australian Aboriginal English. So although we cannot put that as many words that we would like, at least the words that we do have could be a starting point for people who want to learn more about the variety, so that they would be inspired to, you know, go to the A&D and learn more about Australian words from, you know, what they are able to, from the small snapshot that they can see from the OED, because of course the A&D is a much more complete and comprehensive and varied record of Australian English than the OED can ever be.
right. So I'm going to ask all kind of the dumb, obvious questions you always get that make you cringe. One more. Do you have a favorite Australian word out of the new batch, or maybe something else?
Amanda?
Oh, me.
Well, you go first. I want to know yours.
Just looked at your list to see if there was one that I really loved, other than no wuckers, perhaps, which I do quite like, but I'm not sure whether or not I'm allowed to talk about that in polite company.
This is not necessarily polite company, so you can. What was the word?
I was gonna pick that one for mine.
Yeah, good. It's a good expression. Yeah, I mean, I sort of like that you put in chicken salt, actually, which we only just recognized as being an Australianism. I think, you know, this is basically a seasoning that you use mostly on chips here, hot chips, French fries, for Americans. Yeah, I quite like that you put that into your update, because yeah, we had only just sort of recognized that that was an Australian invention. It was invented in Adelaide. So yeah, that's kind of quite cool. In my new book, I talk about drop bears. I quite like drop bears. I don't know if how well Americans know this, but the story is that during the Second World War, visiting American GIs were told to watch out for the drop bears, and these were basically these very vicious koala creatures that would jump on you, land on you from trees if you walked under them. We actually don't have any evidence from the Second World War, although that's the anecdotal evidence. Our first evidence is from the 1960s, but we do still quite like to terrify visiting journalists, and we have actually managed to make some journalists dress up in protective gear, thinking that they're going to be on a koala. So it's a great story, and sort of fits into that great idea that Australia is full of all these really vicious, terrifying creatures. I mean, we do actually have some genuinely terrifying creatures, but the koala isn't one of them. So I do quite like the story of the drop bear.
So I guess the koalas can be quite cheeky in the Australian Aboriginal sense.
Or
So my one is the one that Amanda mentioned. So I have to say it very carefully.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you'd have to bleep me.
Right.
So it's 2 expressions in the update. So the longer version is no walking furries. So if you exchange the initial letter on the last 2 words, that's what.
No worries, which we
so it's no worries
associate with Australia.
To have put some emphasis on it, and you say no walking furries in Australia.
Right.
And then they shortened it to no walkers. So that's why no worries in Australian English is just, simply no walkers now. But that's where it comes from the no walking furries, which is a very dangerous thing to say very quickly. But yeah, that's a really cool one, because it shows you the kind of the shortening thing that Australians are really into with the no walkers, but it also shows the kind of very informal, very, very Australian and sense of humor, which I always love when I'm working on words.
Yeah, and I would say the no walking furries, you might not include that because it's just sort of wordplay, but then the shortening makes it sort of worthy of inclusion. Is that accurate?
Yeah, but I think it's become so much of a fixed combination of words that it deserves, and so specifically Australian, so you wouldn't hear an American or a British person say that it's just really, and it's so clever and funny that I think it deserves its space in the dictionary. And then of course it's productive. It's also become the source of this other shorter expression as well.
How long has it been around?
What?
I mean, popularly.
I think if I can just check, so we dated to 1986. So just the age. So it's not. I'm older than the word.
Yeah, that's our first evidence as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And the shortening came not that much later. So we have 88 for no walkers. So that's.
No, we have 1986.
That's interesting.
Ooh, okay. We already found at least one.
I lie. The 2 entries are together. So you're right.
1988. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the kind of conversations that we have with the A&D. Just checking antedatings.
We're happy just to sit back and watch the interchange. So we have a question. If there's we got a few more minutes, not a lot of time, but if you have a question to ask, now's a good time to ask it. Just put it in the chat and we'll call on you. And Patty Boyd has a question for us.
Hi, folks. This is probably an embarrassing question because I'm an American, but I'm just wondering how different and similar New Zealand English vocabulary is. I know being an American, I think we just lump you all together, but I understand they're very different. I just wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer that if that's okay with you, Danica.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of common vocabulary items between Australia and New Zealand English, and certainly Australia does like to sort of claim things that may well have, their very first evidence as being New Zealand. So we often have also New Zealand, also NZ. There's a dictionary of New Zealand English, which came out in I don't know, early 90s, I think it is. I can't quite remember the date. And unfortunately, no one's actually really doing much work, as far as I know, on New Zealand English. So that's a bit of a frustration because we don't really know how much, we sort of get some idea of how much common vocabulary we still have and new words that are coming in that we share with New Zealand. So there's definitely a big shared vocabulary. I don't know percentage-wise, like how much is shared. Obviously, the big difference for us would be the influence in Australian English of Aboriginal languages and in New Zealand English of Maori. So that would be a big difference. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of commonalities and shared vocabulary across the ditch. So yeah, we often do talk about Australia and New Zealand, and I think you would say, Danica, that in the Oxford English Dictionary there would be a number of things that would be labelled Australian.
Australian and New Zealand. So when we work on, we try not to lump them together because, of course, out of respect, I mean, these are two separate countries with separate cultures, and of course, the difference between the large influence of Maori and Maori English in New Zealand and Australian Aboriginal languages in Australia. So that's a big main difference. But there's actually a really great question and a good segue to that OED news that I was telling you about before we started.
Yes, you teased something exciting, right?
I've actually been doing a lot of interviews for New Zealand recently because in the OED September update, we published a batch of new words from New Zealand. And that includes an expression that Amanda just used right now in her response when she said across the ditch. So we've just added the use of ditch to mean the Tasman Sea. So the same way that we say across the pond, between the UK and the US, Australians and New Zealanders talk about going across the ditch when they talk about each other because the ditch is the Tasman Sea that separates them. So that's one of the new New Zealand words that we added in the recent update. But of course, it's also marked as Australian because Australian uses the word too. So that happens a lot, that when we could be working on an Australian project or a New Zealand project, but then certain words will have to label with both Australian and New Zealand because they are used in both places. So we see it in the research. And the OED news that I was talking about is that, so this batch of Australian words is pretty big. It's 60 words. So that's how, in the past 10 years, since we started the World English program, is how we've always approached World English as in the OED. So every year doing large projects for specific varieties of English. But with that approach, it means that some varieties don't get worked on again for another few years. So we could have the Australian update today, but with that approach, we wouldn't have another update until many years later. But now what we're doing is, instead of doing these huge updates for specific varieties every few years, what we're now doing is going to be including regular updates for all the major varieties of English that we cover in all of the 4 quarterly updates of the OED. So every variety is assigned a specific update, and they will be updated annually. So we just released the first set of these annual updates this September. So that included New Zealand. So that's why we had all these New Zealand words, but it also included East Africa, the Caribbean, and Wales. So
Wales.
Yeah, so it's a big, every update you want to have quite a range of varieties from different parts of the world. And for Australia, so Australia is assigned to the June update. So that means that in every June update of the OED, you will have at least a dozen or so words coming from Australia. So if everyone in the audience are interested in the 60 words that you just added, so you can look forward in a few months to even more of these Australian words. And every June, every June update from now, we're going to have new Australian words. So that means that with this new approach, that we can be sure that we're updating all of the varieties that we cover in a more consistent and regular way. And for me as well, it's really good because it means that I get to, instead of spending 3 years just doing Australian English, mostly Australian English, and they get to do like different things every year. And it just makes us really much more aware of just how much variety there is in the use of English, and makes World English is really a part of the business as usual of the OED. It's not just some special thing we do every year, every few years,
Yeah.
but every single year.
Right. Well, that's exciting. That's very cool and something to continue to look forward to. Really quick, Amanda, I wanted to ask you again about Australia in 100 words, new book, so you need to promote it. But what I assume it's not just a list of 100 Australian words, but there's more to it than that.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So the book is basically the aim is to sort of tell the story of Australia through 100 words. And so each word gets about 800 to 1,000 words in an entry. And I sort of go through from sort of pre-invasion, talking about deep time and Jakurpa or dreaming, through to recent words like democracy sausage, which is what we get when we go out to vote. And use each of those entries to sort of talk about particular themes in Australian history, to tell some kind of like diverse stories about Australia across time. I talk about both the kind of iconic Australian words like fair go and digger and dinkum and those kind of words, as well as some less well-known terms. So yeah, that's the goal. It's to sort of give people a bit of an insight into Australian English and into the Australian story in an accessible way through talking about language.
Okay. Well, we will look for that. That will be exciting to get to grab when it comes out to our shores. Thank you both. It's been such a fun hour. I mean, I just love this. I took the summer off. I feel like, oh my gosh, this is so cool to be back in it and to talk to a couple of really interesting people has been a joy. So thank you both very much.
Thank you so much,
And
Mike. It's been a pleasure.
we will be back in 2 weeks because we're trying to make up for lost time. So we're not gonna wait a month. We're gonna wait 2 weeks, and we've got Ben Yagoda, and this is kind of a theme. Ben Yagoda's book is called Gobsmacked, and he's been tracing words that come over from Great Britain, from British English, and work their way into American English. So these are newer words. This is maybe the Downton Abbey effect, where we've adopted words that from the mother tongue. So so we got a theme going. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with Ben Yagoda to talk about his book. And thank you all very much for coming, and we'll see you in a while.